Our next panel provides some research updates from University of Oregon faculty. Moderating the panel is Representative Karin Power. Thank you for joining us, Representative Power.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I think as a few of us were talking as folks were coming back from lunch, this is the best possible way I think we could be spending the afternoon and looking ahead to the future of options both here in the state and nationally, and how we advance our nation's clean energy future. It's nice to be with you all. I'm Representative Karin Power. I represent House District 41, so I have parts of Southeast Portland, Milwaukee, and Oak Grove. Up until last week or just a few weeks ago, I was chair of our House Energy and the Environment, and I'm taking on some new transportation roles in the upcoming year, and I'm excited about those. My apologies in advance. I know I have a tough first name, and so I'll do my best to not mispronounce any of yours, but I'm very much looking forward to this panel. So without ado, I understand we're starting off with Professor Amos, who is director of the Environment Initiative, UO Environment Initiative, interdisciplinary work at a research university. I'm very excited. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Power, for your leadership and your service. And let me add my welcome to all of you that have joined us today. And I also just want to take a quick minute to acknowledge what's occurring in our nation's capital and to reaffirm a deep commitment and professional dedication to the rule of law, elections and democracies, and the peaceful transition of power. For me, it makes the content-driven and substantive work that we're doing here today even more inspiring. So I want you to know that I appreciate each of you deeply, and I appreciate the work that you all do. I'm going to share my screen. Give me a second. Hopefully somebody say if it's well, it's failing to share, so you may just get me live. Let me try one more time. Sorry about that. Did we get it?
Yep, we did.
All right, see, it worked. My name's Adell Amos. I teach at the law school. I serve as the faculty director of our Provost's Environment Initiative. And this is a new effort to bring together our entire campus around a set of shared guiding principles for our research, our teaching, and our service around issues of the environment. Environment research and teaching at U of O is nothing new, but support and commitment from the Provost's office and to bring together the entire university and bring our work together is new. And I'm quite excited that the Provost has asked me to help lead up that effort. In particular, as Provost Phillips mentioned earlier today, and as I think the panel that we have for you showcases, this effort is designed to amplify and support research on important public policy issues, like the importance of advancing a carbon-free energy future for our state, for our ecoregion, and for the globe that is equitable and addresses issues of social and environmental justice. I'm here to share a bit of information about this initiative and to share the principles that are guiding this effort. As you can see, looking at this list, our work here today is indicative of these principles in action. This webinar today, and this panel in particular, focuses on policy relevant, applied, translational research and teaching at the University of Oregon. You will see the ways in which this research addresses questions of equity and fairness. It is responsive to a call to action that is relevant and useful to the state of Oregon, our ecoregion, and has the potential to be an exemplar for places around the nation and the globe. And it will help inform our work to help our students think about and prepare for their new professional pathways in a changing world. Our goal today is to share briefly with the community, industry, and important decision makers and legislators just some of the scholars and expertise that engage in research and teaching in the area of clean energy. Today we have 4 schools and colleges represented: the Colleges of Arts and Sciences by the Division of Natural Sciences, specifically our chemistry expertise, the College of Design through both the School of Architecture and School of Planning, Public Policy and Management, the Lundquist College of Business, and the School of Law. And the group gathered here today showcases the kind of expertise that I think U of O can offer on this particular topic, our energy future and decarbonization, and the various disciplines that are relevant and useful as we navigate to a shared, just, and sustainable future. Through this initiative, we also hope to bring our efforts to teach, research, and serve to a broad range of urgent environmental issues and questions. I invite you to check out our new website, which begins the process to capture the full breadth and depth of the work here at the University of Oregon. I am proud and inspired by the work of my colleagues that you're about to hear from, and I hope this represents just the beginning of many possibilities in this area and in other substantive areas. With that, I will turn it back over to you, Representative Power.
Thanks. Next, I'd like to welcome Professor Boettcher with the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry and Materials Science Institute on technical challenges and solutions to an inevitable clean energy future. How fast will we get there?
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to speak a little bit today. I'm going to talk mostly not things that we've done at the University of Oregon that I'll weave in a few here. So I wanted to start this webinar with some background information. So, I find that almost everybody I talk to, all the students, they've heard of climate change. They know it's a potential threat. They know it's linked to CO2, but haven't necessarily seen the actual data that describes this. So I wanted to show just a few slides of that data. So here's the CO2 concentration measured accurately in the atmosphere. You see it oscillates every year as the northern hemisphere grows in the spring and summer. But it's been increasing. And so here's 1960, here's 2020. In the last 60 years, it's gone from 300 ppm to 400 ppm. But that's not all the data that's out there. So you can actually go back a million years, almost a million years of actual data showing the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. You get this by drilling ice cores in the Antarctic, where layers represent time back. And you can see it's hovered, it's oscillated from about around 200 ppm. And this unequivocally human-caused CO2 rise has happened in the last 150 years, has doubled the long-term average over the last million. Okay, this has led, again, data, accurate data collected, global average land-based temperature measurements showing the average temperature on the planet for the last 140 years. And it's increased 3.5 degrees, correlating with the Industrial Revolution. You can look at Northern Hemisphere sea ice, it's decreased. When the sea ice decreases, of course, sea level rises, threatening our coastal communities. And this is, again, data. This is not a hypothesis. This is 10 inches of sea level rise over the last 140 years. So this is real. CO2 also is changing the chemistry of our planet. So CO2 reacts with water. This is a basic chemical reaction. You'll learn as a freshman chemist learn this. And it creates acid in the ocean. So that's why the pH of the ocean is decreasing, and it's been measured. Statistically relevant decreases in the pH that correlate with a 30% increase in acidity. That's because 40% of the CO2 we've emitted is now in the ocean. That is causing a mass extinction of calcifiers, shellfish, coral, that can't make their shells in the acidic conditions. Okay, so where does this stuff come from? We all know it comes from burning fossil fuels by economic sector. Quite a bit of it's from electricity and heat production, something that's being talked about today, from buildings, from transportation, from industry. All these things that I've circled are things that we actually have the technology today that if we scale, we can make carbon neutral. The technology exists today, and I'll show you that. So here's one of those technologies. So you've all heard of solar cells or photovoltaics. You're probably aware that the costs have been dropping. What's remarkable is how fast they've been dropping. So the cost of solar-derived electricity is now, along with wind, the cheapest form of electricity on the planet, the cheapest form on the planet. It's absolutely true. If you put solar panels in a large installation in a sunny place, it's the cheapest electricity you can get anywhere. And the reason is because of a lot of technology innovation, a lot of hard work by scientists and engineers, plus a dramatic scaling of production. Every order of magnitude increasing in production and scaling gets to learning, drives the cost down. And so we've come down several orders of magnitude. 20 years ago, we thought this was impossible, but now it's reality. So this is happening across the clean energy sectors. You want to think about what would it actually look like. Say we got all our electricity from renewables. Renewables are intermittent, so the solar resource varies. This is a simulation if we got 100% from those sources. The wind resource varies. So we need storage. We know that. We need storage for night versus day. We can do that with batteries, but we need longer duration storage between the seasons, storage between, say, 1981 and 1985, when a given year might have more renewable than another year. So we need really long-term storage. So one solution, the solution in the short term that is available to us now is chemistry. So one of those chemistries is the lithium-ion battery. This is a Nobel Prize last year. This is shuttling lithium ions between a high energy state and a low energy state, storing energy, put electricity in, get it back out. It's the same battery we have in our cell phones, except the cost has dramatically decreased. Again, a factor of 5 decrease as we learn and scale production that has led to a cost now, which is on target in the next couple years, so that electric cars will be at true unsubsidized price parity with internal combustion vehicles for long range electric cars. This is going to lead to a complete changeover of our entire fleet in the US, going from ICE vehicles to electric vehicles. The challenge is this curve is flattening out. It's still going down and will continue to go down. And it's hard to imagine how we're going to get to the price point we need for this long duration storage, for storing energy between years and between seasons. And the technology here is hydrogen production. So we can take electricity, we can put it to 2 electrodes, we can split water, pull water molecules apart, make hydrogen, make oxygen. We know how to do that. We know how to do it at scale. And this hydrogen is incredibly useful for storing electricity because we can take that hydrogen, we can use it in industrial applications, but we can also use it in something called a fuel cell where we flow the hydrogen and oxygen back, recombine it, and take the electricity out. So the hydrogen, as shown in this picture from NREL, we can use that as an electricity storage mechanism. We can actually use that to make the fertilizer we need to feed the planet. Biggest energy consumption in making fertilizer is making the hydrogen you need to do that. We can use it to make steel and other metals. We can use it to make chemicals. We can use it for home heating and displace natural gas. So natural gas companies will become hydrogen companies. So, and this is not some fantasy. Companies are doing this. It's a question of how fast will they do it and what policy and what will be make in place to make it possible. So there's every major airplane manufacturer is envisioning a hydrogen-powered airplane. There's no law of physics that says you can't do this. It's going to happen. Question is, how long will we get there? Imagine zero emissions air travel instead of emitting 2 or 3 tons of CO2 every time you fly to New York from Oregon. You can't take a battery and power a ship across the Pacific. That's going to be a fuel cell, as long as long distance trucking and air flight. They'll all be fuel cell hydrogen based. Okay, the cost of electrolysis is coming down. So as electricity cost goes down, electricity cost is dramatically coming down from renewables, particularly when we install so much of this low-cost solar, low-cost wind. We're going to have huge excesses of electricity in times of overproduction. Electricity cost is going to go way down. Hydrogen from electrolysis is going to go way down too as we scale and innovate. In the next 5 or 10 years, you will see a dramatic scaling of this technology. So there's, one more point I wanted to make. You hear a lot of talk about negative emissions, about pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. Places like Oregon could play a really key role here because have a large rural area. We grow a lot of trees. Trees are actually one of the best ways to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. It's a proven technology. And there's been some really nice studies that show we could actually pull over half of the CO2 we've emitted if we just reforested all the areas we've deforested. Okay, so this is talking about forest management and reforestation and investment in rural areas where Oregon can play a huge role. So I just wanted to, this is a really brief overview. We're working on a lot of these things in our group, the technologies, in our center for Oregon Center for Electrochemistry, but some take-home points. Hope people will remember the cost of renewable electricity generation is dramatically dropped. It's no longer expensive. In fact, now it's the cheapest per kilowatt hour of any. The daily, seasonal, and decadal variations can be completely addressed with technology, but we do need to scale that technology and innovate to bring the costs down further. But we know how to do that, and all the cost curves show we can if the investments are there. So what I think we need is clear, ambitious policy, because industry has to take into account risk. New technologies are risky. We need to de-risk these types of renewable technologies, and the way you do that with policy and government investment. Over the next two decades, though, this technology will be the cheapest form of energy on the planet. And if we don't make the investments now, we will actually be disadvantaged as other countries, other regions leapfrog us, having made the investments in the important technologies that makes them more cost effective in the future. And I like to end there. This is our website for our electrochemistry center, where we're doing a lot of the science and technology in this area. Thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Professor Jacobsen with the School of Planning, Public Policy and Management, presenting on economics and decarbonization.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts here and participate in this. I watched a session this morning and learned a lot. Yeah, I'm Grant Jacobsen. I'm an economist and a professor in the School of Planning, Public Policy and Management. I'm going to talk a bit about economics and decarbonization. First thing I want to say is, I think from a economist's perspective, and really maybe just from any, from society's perspective, it's a fascinating time at the moment to be working in energy policy. It has a lot of impacts. Certainly relates to the type of effects we'll be feeling from climate change. It has large implications for equity and justice. It's going to play a big role in the future of the workforce. It's going to affect household budgets as well as business activity. So really a wide-reaching area. And in my remarks here, I want to just provide a little bit of insight on areas where I've done research that I think are going to be relevant as clean energy advances. And in my remarks, I'm going to focus on efficiency and effectiveness, which I think is something that economists and policy analysts have focused on for a long time. And I also want to talk about equity and distributional implications, which I think our economists and policy analysts are increasingly focusing on. And I think the amount of attention it's receiving is, I'd say, dramatically increased, and rightfully so. So first item, as we move to a new energy system, we're probably going to want to use new types of energy prices. And the easiest, I think, example, it's not restricted to this, but the easiest, I guess, application is with respect to intermittent renewables and time variant pricing. So at least for the time being, until storage prices decrease, it's going to be more challenging to ally the supply of renewables with the demand of households and small businesses. And that's costly and also can lead to lack of reliability. One way you can address that is by shifting to time variant prices, where the price that you pay for a kilowatt hour of electricity varies depending on, say, the time of day. And you can implement this in many different channels or through many different systems. You could have real-time pricing or time of use pricing or critical peak prices. And I've done some research on this. And one thing that we're finding is that as you make these systems more complex, households actually become less responsive to them. So there's a trade-off between adding complexity, which is going to allow them to better align with, say, underlying generation patterns, and the response that you're going to get from households, which has to be considered in their design. Also, any pricing system that you implicate or apply rather is going to have substantial equity implications. For example, volumetric charges, which can be useful for raising revenue to fund programs, often are regressive. And thinking carefully about that is going to be important as we sort of move to new energy prices. Another area I've worked on that I think is interesting is infrastructure adoption. So a lot of, I think, clean energy advancement, you might think of, say, expanding renewables, but optimizing the expansion of renewables and sort of optimizing all the different elements that can go into energy policy requires coordination across areas. And I think the easiest way to conceptualize this is, say, encouraging the adoption of electric vehicles at the same time as we encourage the expansion or mandate the expansion of renewable generation. There's other types of infrastructure that I think ideally we would have policies to support their adoption. For example, smart appliances that could take advantage of time varying prices that I highlighted in the previous slide. And as we kind of seek to, I guess, increase adoption of new forms of infrastructure, we can do that through a variety of channels. You could use standards or penalties or subsidies. And as with the last case, there are important equity implications here. So this slide on the right, for example, from some of my research shows where energy efficiency incentives have gone. And in particular, what is your likelihood of receiving an energy efficiency incentive, like say a rebate or tax credit, depending on your income? And what you can see is that these incentives are dramatically concentrated in higher income households. So think about how we can design these incentives or other types of policies to spur adoption, yet doing so in a way that considers distributional effects as another area that I think is going to be important as policy advances. Final, I guess, slide related to my research. A lot of, as we sort of move to this new policy world, a lot of what we expect to see as a result of policies is based on simulations or models, engineering models, for example, that are based on a lot of underlying assumptions. And those assumptions may be accurate or they may be inaccurate. They're at minimum uncertain in many cases. And as a result, what you think might transpire when you enacted a policy may not actually transpire. And for that reason, I think it's important to continually be gathering data and analyzing data to see that what's predicted actually plays out. And if it does, that's great. And if it doesn't, that's an opportunity to refine the policy. And I've done work in this area. For example, just here's a title from one of my papers, which is an evaluation to see if the energy savings from enacting more strict building codes aligned with what was predicted by engineering models. So those are my thoughts. Again, I think this is there's an exciting moment right now in a variety of areas and for a broad group of people across both say universities and societies and economies and different jurisdictions. And I hope that myself and other people involved in this webinar and this panel can play a productive role in that, both at UO and abroad through our teaching, research, and service-based contributions. Thanks for listening.
Thanks. All right, we're moving right along, which is great. It looks like we'll have a lot of time for questions towards the end. Next, Professor Russo with the Lundquist School College of Business on management, education for economic growth, sustainability, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adell. I'm just going to move us into screen share. I forgot to turn my microphone on, which would have been embarrassing. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks to everyone involved with this wonderful get-together. I come to the University of Oregon, or came to it in around 1989. So I've got decades of experience in retrospect, but before that, I was working to commercialize wind and solar energy at Pacific Gas and Electric prior to my graduate work. So it's incredibly exciting for me to be here and to look back, but then also to look forward, because I'm sure that wherever we are now, the change in the last 30 years is going to look like nothing compared to the next 30 years. So I'd like to talk about what we do at the Lundquist College of Business. The theme that runs through all that we do is that environmental challenges can be recast as opportunities for innovation and enterprise. I don't for a moment discount that policy is critical, but we work with organizations and businesses all the time to try to thrive in the new environment and understand that as we move to this new world of sustainable enterprise, it's just going to create incredible opportunities. So we have been teaching sustainable business for a quarter of a century at this point. In fact, I've got to apologize because I have to run off at 2 to teach my Packed to the Seams graduate course in sustainable business. But we've got a program for every student here. We've got an MBA in sustainable business practices that has secured a national and even global reputation for outstanding performance. And just a few weeks ago, we were again placed in the top 3 by the Princeton Review. So we draw people nationally, globally, and we put out students that are creating new businesses, many of which are in the state of Oregon. So they're driving a lot of economic opportunity. We've got a minor in sustainable business so that students from outside the business schools can learn sustainable principles. So if you are in the School of Architecture and you're interested in green real estate development, you can learn some principles of entrepreneurship, accounting, and financial principles at the business school. If you're a sociologist interested in environmental activism, you can learn more about how business sees the world to make your advocacy that much more effective. And we've also got an undergraduate concentration in sustainable business that will be the first among business schools at the Association of American Universities business schools to have a concentration. So it's very exciting. Sample of classes, we have quite a few. Naturally, we have some broad sustainable business classes, but also in industrial ecology, where we appreciate the circular economy, the world that we ultimately have to get to. Clean energy finance, life cycle assessment, impact investment, which is incredibly important and growing as we find that there's a whole community of investors that are very interested in directing investment and other resources towards entrepreneurship in greatly needed areas. Another area that we're very involved in is engagement. So we have a long history of experiential learning, everything from a final project in a course to a 6-credit focus project that spans 2 courses. And I've just got a few sample projects here that we've done recently. So in the last couple of years, we worked with Alaska Airlines about introducing biofuels for jets. So this is a real challenge because it's more systemic to the point that it involves changes within the airplanes themselves, but also it's got network effects because of the city pairing of airlines. And so it goes beyond just the technology of fuel use to get into the properties of running an airline. And then we also work with Portland General Electric to find secondary uses for lithium auto batteries, because you get to a point with these electric cars and the batteries cease to be optimal for the cars, yet they still have a great productive life left over. So what do we do with them? And so we're coming up with some ideas for remote usage and so forth. So everybody's involved. In the research area, we've had a Center for Sustainable Business Practices since 2006. So we've been at this quite a while, and we've got thought leadership promoted by 13 research faculty and 4 professional faculty. So we have the interesting interchange between people that have been in the professional world and people that are research active, and it's produced a lot of interesting research. One of the ones that I was recently on was a study that looked at solar and wind energy supply chains. And what we tried to do was go beyond the economic determinants of where these companies are located to look at how they link up with the local values, local social context, and even politics. And it became a really interesting project, and it led to this other set of projects that look at clustering, which is something we typically associate with industries, like Silicon Valley or something. But it turns out that in Oregon and elsewhere, we have clusters of enlightened businesses, and they clustered not based on being in any industry, but actually sharing values. And so that's leading to interesting ideas about how we promote community within these groupings of enlightened businesses. And we've worked in other areas, even servicizing, where we take something that used to be a product and turn it into a service and kind of dematerialize it. And I did want to say, as any good academic, we've got some bandwidth for additional research. And one project, this is a list of projects that we could deliver with interdisciplinary teams. And as I listened to Grant, it suggested that we might want to pull him into one of these projects. But one might be models of consumer decision makings to predict adoption of green initiatives. So myself and probably many of you have had somebody come over and do an energy audit at a significant expense. We could apply experimental means as a way to appreciate how to maximize the extent to which homeowners then implement the recommendations of the audit. And there's certainly a financial component to that, but there's also more to it. There may be effects of telling them what people in their neighborhood have done. And it may be that the more that people in their neighborhood have adopted these, they're more likely to. But it's certainly something that we could work with Energy Trust on, for example. And there's a lot of data that they've got to bring to bear. We could also work in some of these other areas, but I guess my message to follow up in is we're a tremendous resource for you, and I hope to exchange ideas as appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Professor Brown from the School of Planning, Public Policy and Management with Equity and Clean Transportation.
Great, thank you, Representative Power. Hi all, I'm delighted to be here with you all. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about some broad ideas in transportation and how to make our transportation more clean. But I want to talk really, my argument is that by making our transportation greener and cleaner, we actually can also advance equity agendas, really broad steps at making our communities more equitable and lifting up and boosting mobility for those who have been historically marginalized and have the least access to opportunities in Oregon, but in other places in the country as well. So transportation presents a huge opportunity. We've seen some numbers already, but in terms of energy and thinking about how we can invest to make our environment greener, our emissions, reduce our emissions, transportation offers a huge opportunity. About a third of energy in the US and greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. This is both goods movement and personal movement, but again, across the sector of transportation, we have a huge opportunity. And so again, I'm going to argue that how we get there, we can do it in ways that promote equity. And actually the more equitable policies are actually the better way and best way to become greener. So I'm going to talk about two big buckets of policies. I'm not going to talk about every policy. There's so many out there, but I want to give some examples about how policies that are designed with an equity lens can actually most deliver on the green and sustainable future we all want to see. So two possible paths forward to make cleaner transportation and reduce our emissions and energy use. One is to change the energy mix. And so by that, I mean, we right now rely primarily on diesel and gasoline in our transportation. So how can we change that into using predominantly electric and clean electric for transportation? So that's one way to reduce our energy consumption. And the other is to actually just reduce the total energy consumed. And by that, I don't mean travel less. So transportation planners, of which I am one, we really like travel. Travel means access to opportunities. But we can do our travel in more efficient ways and using less energy. So that means getting people out of their single occupied cars and onto transit, walking, biking. And currently a lot of our systems aren't set up for people to do that successfully. And so we have to think critically about policies to allow people to take advantage of those different opportunities. And again, I'm going to stress in a minute how that is an equity policy. So for both of these, we can do them in a variety of ways. But again, if we approach them with an equity first policy, I think we can both, again, enhance equity within our state, lift up those who have been historically marginalized, and actually get to a greener future more successfully and faster. So let me give you a few examples. If we're looking to change the energy mix, that means electrifying the fleet, cars, trucks, the whole gamut of vehicles. I'm going to focus on personal vehicles. A lot of policy has focused on that so far through things like vouchers or rebates. Oregon actually has a great rebate program to date, one of the more equitable ones in the country, but I want to just use it as an example of how we can think about equity first policies being also best for the environment. So when we look at who owns cars and what types of cars they own, low-income households tend to own the older and least fuel-efficient cars. So they're using the most energy. It's also more expensive for them to then operate those cars. But when we then have vouchers or rebates for electric vehicles, sometimes they're not extending to used cars. They're only, for example, available for people who are buying Teslas. Teslas are great, but they're really expensive, right? So is $2,500 rebate really going to make a marginal difference in people's decision to buy a Tesla? Is it going to be pushing people into buying an electric car? And in terms of thinking about the cars that we're taking off the road and replacing with those electric vehicles, we're probably not taking the cars off the road that are the oldest and least fuel efficient. So how can we target these vouchers to both get to the people who could most benefit from them, so the people who are already cost burdened by car ownership, while also taking the dirtiest cars off our road. And that's thinking about used cars, thinking about caps on how expensive a car might be to qualify for a voucher. There's a variety of ways, but again, equity first means both helping the people who can't afford this technology otherwise and gets the dirtiest vehicles off our roads faster. Another example is, where are we putting charging stations? So sometimes we're investing in or publicly subsidizing charging stations for electric vehicles. We have to think critically about where those are. So are they only in single family homes, for example? Are they going into multifamily homes? If, for example, again, we're trying to get the dirtiest cars off the fleet or the least fuel efficient cars, we need to be thinking about older cars, typically are driven by lower income households who disproportionately live, compared to higher income households, live in multifamily units. So how can we actually give them and provide the technology and the infrastructure to enable and support electric vehicle ownership? So it's not just about rolling out the charging stations, right? It's about thinking really critically about where are we doing that and who are we reaching with our investments. And again, policy has an important role to play in leveraging and being strategic about this. There's also a question about environmental justice. So this is essentially a way to both think about how to bring on board additional advocates and additional allies, but also a positive spillover effect of changing the energy mix in our transportation system. So when we think about environmental justice, the disproportionate impacts that pollution and other particulate matters, et cetera, have on low-income communities and communities of color, environmental justice is a transportation issue. So we think about highways, for example, and big roadways. Disproportionately living alongside those roadways are low-income communities, communities of color, living next to railway stations, for example. So cleaning our transportation is inherently an environmental justice issue. And by cleaning our transportation, we reduce the emissions, the pollutants that are coming out of our vehicles, and we reduce the health impacts on those communities. Okay, so changing the energy mix was one piece of shifting our energy and transportation and reducing energy consumption. The other, again, is simply reducing total energy consumption. And I'm gonna argue the way to do that is really investing in car alternatives. So we do that a lot already in Oregon, not to the degree that places like Europe, for example, subsidize a lot of these other modes. And by definition, investing in car alternatives is an equity strategy. When you look at who owns cars, most American households own cars, but those who don't are disproportionately low income. It costs about $9,000 a year to own and operate a car in the US. It's really expensive. It's extremely burdensome. And the way our cities are often set up and what we invest in means that people without cars are often left out of opportunities, access to healthcare, jobs, COVID testing drive-throughs, right? A lot of opportunities that we don't even think about that result in being disenfranchised from a lot of opportunities that society affords. And so investing in car alternatives, transit, walking, biking, and making those really robust alternatives that say come frequently, get people where and when they want to go and do it in a reliable way, is going to boost the options for those with the current who currently have the fewest, while also providing choice to those looking to say make greener habits, save money by not driving, etc. So again, my overall argument, leave you with again, we have huge opportunity to make transportation greener, and by doing it in an equity lens manner, we can actually both improve equity for our communities and also deliver a greener future faster. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Professor Kwok with the School of Architecture and Environment on energy efficient buildings and net zero design.
You can see everything. Let me.
Yeah.
We're seeing your presenter slides, not the.
Okay, let me change. Sorry about that. Had it all set up. All right. Well, I'm very, very happy to be here. Thank you so much for being allowing me to be part of this. It's very exciting. It's like getting a course in Coursera, this whole session. So thank you. I'm going to show a number of case studies, buildings of different scales. And I thought I would first start by saying that, I'm just excited to be able to teach design to students and having them figure out how to make low carbon buildings. So I'm going to start with a personal real example. Last year, I designed and completed an energy efficient house, all electric, that made it to Earth Advantage Platinum and also Passive House certification. It has a very small photovoltaic array on the roof, and it brings in clean, filtered, air conditioned in the summer, heated air right now, dehumidifies, does ventilation 24/7. And the cool part about this is that it has, in the August and September, it used only $18 of electrical energy was the bill. And last month it was about $52, including the base cost. So I did this sort of to walk the talk, but also to use it as a teaching model for my students. So looking at how in the residential sector of how we heat our homes, this graphic shows by county that how we're doing on electric heating. Let's see, we're doing pretty well, but the real question is how clean is that energy? And right now about 50% of houses use electric energy, and then it scales down from there, natural gas and then wood. But I think where we're going to see a lot of efficiencies is as we scale up to multifamily housing. Oregon has a lot of resources, and at the university here, as well as in the region, we are training the next generation of students to be able to design buildings that are sustainable. We have, through our courses, through our advanced seminars, through technical teaching, we even have the first ASHRAE student branch in the state of Oregon at an architecture school instead of an engineering school. And there are a number of alums that are not only practicing in the region, but practicing nationally, internationally, globally, as well as teaching in architecture schools. And very, very recently, in the last five years or so, we have really started a program to train students to become certified passive house consultants, and we have more than 75, probably more than any other school in the country. So that's a huge beginning. And Oregon has a lot of firsts in terms of building sustainably, but also really looking at building practices. And this is the Stellar Apartments, which is the first passive house certified multifamily housing in the country. It was followed shortly after by Orchards Adorenco in Portland in 2015. But what was unique about this project is that the contractor, the building owner, and the architects came together to really look at their building practices. they had a chance looking at this complex of 12 buildings that are all usually built to Earth Advantage standards, which are about 10 to 15% better than code. And they took one building, the yellow building on the left, and decided to go for the Passive House standard. And the side-by-side buildings were monitored for performance over a 2-year period by students. And so one of the things that they looked at was this space heating use. And if you recall, a number of years ago, there was a very, very cold winter. It got to 11 degrees. And then the next winter was a little bit milder, but you can see right away that the yellow bar is the Passive House heating system, and the green bar is the Earth Advantage. And Earth Advantage was doing very well, but Passive House was going at almost half the heating. When we really looked at behavior of how people used appliances and their systems, the energy savings went down even more. So on the commercial end, this is the Bullitt Center in Seattle, and this really accelerated sort of the pace of change in realizing that it is possible to have a Class A commercial building in dense downtown Seattle meet the Living Building Challenge, which means that it was net zero energy, net zero water, net zero waste, and also used non-toxic materials. It used off-the-shelf products that could be used in any project for this project. And I believe that in the last 3 years, it's actually been net positive. So it doesn't mean that every single commercial building will need a big rooftop like that, but it just demonstrates the possibilities of it all coming together in one place. And the last building that I'll show is a project in Oregon, and this received a lot of awards and press, but I think the innovation here is that for the Music and Science building in Hood River, the goal was to put together a program where not only the students, but the Hood River community could discover, learn, research, and experience not only what net zero design is, but what a sustainable building and community could do for their for them, for this region. So these are examples of buildings of showing where it's possible to have a net carbon zero future. So thank you. And I'll stop sharing now.
Those were lovely. Thank you for sharing them. Our last panelists today, and Professor, I'm going to try to say your last name, so my apologies.
It's okay.
Vanden Wijmelenberg.
Perfect. Nicely done. Thank you.
Thank you. With the School of Architecture and Environment on electrification and public health in buildings. Great to have you.
Thank you. All right. Hopefully these slides will share. Are we up? I'm not seeing if someone could give me a verbal that it's good.
It looks great.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. So thanks for the opportunity. Really happy to be here. Thanks for taking the time and dedicating it to this important topic. I'm going to talk about electrification and public health. So I'll do my best and mash that all into 7 minutes. So in order to address climate change, we've talked about multiple sectors, and buildings are another really important sector to ensure that we're addressing if we want to, stop and reverse climate change. Buildings account for roughly 46% of the energy use in the country. Most of this is for operating the building, but as we get more and more efficient operating the building, there also becomes a point where we need to spend even more attention on the construction process. But in general, as you operate a building longer, the greater and greater proportion of the energy that building is responsible for is coming from the operating energy consumption. So since about half of our energy flows through buildings, architecture is both an important piece of the problem, but also our future solutions. And since we're focused today on clean electricity, I'll note that 75% of the electricity consumption in the US also runs through buildings. So buildings are a really important piece of this equation. And our industry has been working on electrification and decarbonization for decades, at least back to the energy crisis in the 70s and the oil embargo and the earliest energy codes that really were spawned out here in the West to reduce energy consumption in buildings. And it's been accelerated since 2005 when a gentleman by the name of Ed Mazaria launched a program called the Architecture 2030 Challenge. Really what this challenge says is by the year 2030, our buildings are aiming to be carbon free in their energy consumption. And major professional organizations, Allison, Dr. Kwok mentioned ASHRAE, the Engineering Professional Society, and the AIA, which is the Architectural Professional Society. They've adopted this. We're working toward it, but they've said this is the goal, this is our expectation, and we're working toward meeting net zero energy by the year 2030. And that would apply to new construction as well as any major renovations that are occurring. Dr. Kwok also mentioned the concept of net zero energy buildings. And this is actually the pathway to net zero that the Bullitt Foundation used, but really it's a generalizable pathway. We've been working on increasing the energy efficiency of buildings as the first idea, the first measure in. Yes, photovoltaics on the roof are great, but you have to really reduce energy loads if you want the building to be net zero on site, because you have to buy photovoltaics on site. And if we want the building to be net zero, even if it's not site net zero, but wherever that energy is coming from, wherever they're securing those energy resources, you need to reduce the energy consumption in the first place. So that's the first measure in, is always to reduce energy consumption. And you can see here how much lower than a typical building or even a new code building the Bullitt Center is. The number on the far right is 16. That's a number that's called the energy use index. It's just think of it as the total amount of energy used in a year into a generalized unit. It's in kilobtus in this case, but it doesn't matter what the fuel source is. And it's actually operating more at like 12. So it was designed to operate at 16. It's exceeding performance. It's operating closer to 12. A code building in Seattle when this was built would probably be around 30. A typical building around 50. And some of the older baselines even much, much higher, as you can see there on the far left, 92. So energy efficiency is first measure in. Net zero buildings also tend to pursue 100% electrification, especially if they want to be net zero on site. And we've heard that electric utilities are pursuing decarbonization strategies. And we've heard that building owners and designers and engineers are pursuing electrification strategies because they're pursuing these aggressive net zero energy strategies. And so really what we're describing is a converging set of priorities that are creating new and important synergies. So both new and retrofit buildings and homes are aiming to be smart, efficient buildings. Usually there's some sort of digital control system. And when you have that digital control system associated with your home or your building, it creates this opportunity to interact with smart grids. So smart, efficient buildings are increasingly connected to smart and efficient grids. And together, smart grids and smart buildings can work to ease the volatility in those supply and demand profiles, reduce the overall energy supply that's needed and reduce the peak demand or the amount of capacity that your energy infrastructure needs to support. This should lead to a more nimble and a more resilient infrastructure. I also wanted to show that the graphic there on the left is real. It's happening. These concepts are real and they're happening in the real world. We know how to build net zero energy buildings. We're getting better at building them more economically. As we scale up these principles, similar to what previous presenters discussed, the cost will decrease. We know it's possible. But here we're showing 3 years worth of data. You can see the humps in the data and the months underneath. And it's for the Bullitt Center in Seattle. And it shows that the energy use is in the gray bar at the bottom, which is actually quite flat by comparison to most energy profiles of most buildings. So an energy efficient building inherently starts to flatten those volatilities. Then you pair it with a building that's providing much of its own energy consumption on site. That's the orange region. And you can see there's many times where this building is exporting energy to its neighbors. And that can start to settle neighborhoods down and balance feeder lines and transportation and distribution infrastructure for the electric utility system. Yes, there are some periods of the year where the building is importing energy, either from offsite renewable or perhaps from other fuel sources. But on the balance, this building is shipping 60% more energy than it uses back to the infrastructure, back to the grid. Okay, these trends also create other important synergies with public health. So the non-medical determinants of health are the primary determinants of health. It's hard to believe, but it is true. Environmental determinants of health are also disproportionately impacting the low income and populations and communities of color. Buildings impact our health, both chronically and acutely. For example, increased exposure to indoor and outdoor sourced particulates has been associated with chronic and acute respiratory disease. We recently completed an EPA-funded study that showed that occupants in weatherized homes, those are homes that have gone through a program to minimize how much unintended infiltration, how much unintended outside air is coming in, usually supplemented with intentional filtered or heat pump regulated, heat exchanger regulated outside air, has shown to reduce asthma attacks among surveyed respondents. And a similar Oak Ridge National Lab study showed a correlation between home weatherization and a reduction of uninsured respiratory related ER visits, which of course then has connections to the healthcare infrastructure. The Oregon Public Utilities Commission has recognized reduced wood burning for heat as a measurable and verifiable improvement to public health, and are actually allowing utilities to take advantage of that in their what are called their total resource cost tests, which support the weatherization assistance programs. And we know now better than ever before how important healthy buildings are to a vibrant community and economy. Wildfire smoke and the indoor toxicants have been indicated to increase asthma and autoimmune disorders. Poor indoor air quality has been indicated to increase COVID-19 transmission or other disease transmission. So truly healthy indoor and outdoor air is the critical path to public health. And clean, energy efficient buildings and clean electric grids are the key to achieving clean air. So what's it going to take? Policy, connecting maybe disproportionate, formerly disconnected pots of resources. 2, and 3, workforce education. So from a policy standpoint, we know what some of this looks like: energy codes, building energy reporting and labeling programs, perhaps building carbon management programs. Certain buildings that are the worst offenders might be expected to improve performance even without a code triggered building improvement. 100% clean energy goals and policies. From the disparate pots of funding, I just challenge us to think about, we need to find ways to connect these disparate pots of funding, specifically the healthcare spend and the energy and infrastructure spend, or the buildings and infrastructure spend. So there's a reason we've learned to build net zero energy buildings, and it's because we've had public purpose financed research and development and incentives to promote learning how to do more energy efficient and net zero buildings. And there aren't really similar programs out there to support research and development on a healthy buildings perspective. But if we can unlock healthy buildings at the same time as we unlock energy efficient and clean energy buildings, then we're going to increase equity and increase our impact, because we're touching the people in addition to the infrastructures. And then finally, workforce training, architects and engineers and building operators at multiple levels through high schools and community colleges, as well as other higher ed and professional outreach. So we've been trying to help this cause by stitching together an ecosystem of individuals who care about this. This is just a quick snapshot of the institute at the university that I run, called Institute for Health in the Built Environment. Collaborate with many faculty here at U of O, as well as other universities, to help sort of stitch together the expertise that are needed to envision and realize this healthy and energy efficient building future. Last piece is to connect with industry so that it's taken up and moved into practice. Thank you so much.
Thanks to each of you for such interesting and thought-provoking presentations. Each of your areas of work is so interesting and so unique, and yet the ways in which this panel offers opportunities for us policymakers to think about how policies could diverge and work together is really interesting. So participants, you have the ability to ask questions in the Q&A. Some of the more logistical questions can be answered sort of offline, but I'm going to start with one that has been asked by Tim Miller, who is querying what was the result of the economic analysis about building codes in Florida, and would the same apply here in Oregon? And keep them coming in. We have about 12 minutes.
I can answer that question. So in our Florida study, we found that the predicted savings from the engineering simulations lined up with what was realized based on the billing data. I think it's actually kind of an ongoing debate, though. Researchers in California, Eric Levinson, had a prominent study that seemed to suggest that California's standards, which were quite aggressive, didn't sort of fully deliver on what was promised. But then there was a follow-up study by some researchers at Davis that said maybe they delivered. But I think collectively it's a difficult empirical problem, and we're still trying to pin it down. But overall, it seems like codes are an effective tool in terms of increasing the efficiency of buildings and ultimately leading to energy savings.
Okay, I'll turn next. And it is something we've been thinking about. Senator Biochemistry asked, net zero building codes make great sense. But what do we do about the 85 to 90% of buildings that already exist and will still be used? And I think more broadly for any of the panelists, it's true of so many of the things that we've already built and put in place. We have challenges in transitioning into new, more energy efficient processes, systems, infrastructure, when the stuff that we currently have works and can continue to be patched together and maintained for a little bit longer. So I'll throw it out to any of you who want to weigh in on that.
Well, I'll just start, since I mentioned a little bit about it as well. So, it's not going to happen overnight. And for example, the Architecture 2030 challenge says, as buildings go through major upgrades, the idea would be to take those buildings along for the ride. Economics have to work, or these things don't happen. But I always say, look, there are plenty of examples in the world, which is proof that it's possible. And if it was built, it's economically possible as well. And so we have to learn as quickly as we can from those examples. And then I know that the question was briefly answered, and I'm not sure if everyone can see that, but one other pathway is to start doing, first voluntary disclosure, then mandatory disclosure of energy consumption, give the consumer vision into, well, what is the energy profile of this home or this building? And then eventually, as it makes sense, start to encourage or require upgrades to some of the worst offenders.
I think it could also be part of an infrastructure bill. I mean, what a wonderful job creation opportunity is to unleash an army of semi-skilled people, exactly the type of job we need more of, to go and insulate existing homes. And that has an equity effect for the same reason that Anne was talking about in her remarks, in the sense that you are more likely to live in a poorly insulated building if you're less advantaged.
I guess I'd be remiss as the economist on here if I didn't mention carbon pricing. And I know that's a politically sort of sensitive topic at the moment, and it's been politically challenging, but that is the appeal of carbon pricing, is that it sort of touches all margins potentially. So, you know, standards that are focused on new infrastructure are going to have effects on new infrastructure, but overlook existing infrastructure. Whereas a carbon price would create incentives for retrofits and upgrades in a broad area. So I don't know what the future holds politically, but that is sort of one of the theoretical benefits of using a carbon price.
You know, I'll just add that, you know, if you look at all this, all the economics of all this, I mean, you have to consider what's the most bang for your buck. And, you know, usually the thing that's the cheapest wins, right? And so what I see as a scientist, as a scientist who's interested in technology, you know, the answer is you have to make renewable electricity cheaper than anything else out there. And so I think that's coming. The challenge I see is it's not coming fast enough. So if you look at all the carbon data and the climate data, it's going to be a serious coin flip to whether or not we wreck the global environment along the way to this transition. The transition will happen because of economics. And, you know, eventually people will upgrade their homes because it will get cheaper. And eventually all new power plants, there won't be any new fossil fuel power plants put in, and all the old ones will retire. But you know, that's where the policy and the investments, you know, have to be driving this transition, and then has to be analyzed in an economic way to get the most bang for our buck.
Okay, so unless anybody else wants to weigh in, I'm going to ask a question I saw in the Q&A because I don't know what it means. Hopefully you do. Curious if you've looked at the cost and equity benefits of time of renewables versus TOU, and I'm not quite sure what TOU means. So maybe others who are listening and won't either.
I think
So,
it's time of renewable versus time of use.
Yeah, so I think that question was directed to me, at least in the question and answer. I haven't looked at that that area in particular, but I think it's fascinating. And I do think, like, thinking about how we use time variant pricing in the era of renewables, when we've traditionally thought about it in the era of like heat waves and avoiding overloading the grid, requires to some extent it requires a change in thinking. And I think there's room to be done there in terms of, you know, how policymakers are thinking about it and how researchers are engaging with it.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Sometimes we live in an acronym soup and I don't always catch all of them and how they shorthand for. So I have one myself for Professor Brown. You know, here and again, and I'm going to be new to our transportation committees, the majority of our emissions come from the transportation sector. You know, we know electrification is a piece of that. Hopefully you can hear me over my very cute 5-month-old who's decided to wake up at his classically opportune time. You know, assuming electrification, what are the other top priorities for helping to build a more clean transportation system?
I mean, electrification is really the big one in terms of you know, direct transportation things, but there's a lot of things we could also do that would encourage more sustainable modes, but that spans beyond transportation. It's about building, you know, communities that have jobs and housing combined, mixed use communities. It's also about that piece I talked about, which is getting people out of their cars. But again, making sure that when we do that, it's to modes that, or it's to opportunities that still provide access to jobs, healthcare, et cetera. Because right now, you know, as much as I myself love transit, and bikes and walks, it doesn't work for a lot of people, at least in most places at most times. And so that's why people drive. And so a lot of the question is, how can we make it work for more people? Electrification is the big piece of it, the energy side, but again, housing, tons of other policies can be combined because transportation connects everything. So, in my biased opinion, of course, since I study transportation, I think it's the center of everything, and everything connects back to it.
For the sake of the future who is listening to this recorded presentation, I'm going to turn it back to Adell since Finn has decided to just complain for the remainder of this.
You're a rock star. It's very inspiring to see, having had little ones of my own and tried to navigate these spaces. That's great. So I'm going to just go to the chat panel. There are probably 4 questions. We probably have time for one of them. Panelists, are there any particular questions in the chat that you want to take? If anybody sees one they want, just unmute and go for it. Okay, having heard no one, we'll start. There's a question about whether anyone knows of studies that confirm energy savings at the end user meter after implementation over time, or is it most, if not all, energy savings that are just projected or deemed? Does anyone want to take that one?
I can jump in a bit. I mean, certainly on the balance, there's a lot more projected or deemed savings, but usually those come back to some measured savings somewhere, and then those get extrapolated. So the Regional Technical Forum, which is a function here in the Pacific Northwest of the Pacific Conservation, I'm gonna get it wrong, but the Regional Technical Forum is a group that actually is really well reputed internationally, and they BPA supported, other electric utility supported, and they do their best to tie the deemed savings back to measured data in some capacity. And I would also say with the rollout of advanced metering infrastructure, it's getting easier and easier to do measured evaluations as opposed to deemed or predicted.
Yeah, and I can add one thing. I think for most behavioral and pricing interventions, we're confirming that with billing data for direct infrastructural installations or infrastructure installations, that's definitely deemed savings.
And I was looking for the Northwest Power and Conservation Council.
Great. So Heather, I don't know if we want to take one more question or if we want to wrap up this panel.
I think we can go ahead and wrap it up and let's get moving. I do want to thank Representative Power and your little one for participating today. And of course, all the panelists, thank you so much.